Hey guys, it's Brian. Today I'm going to go through uh, an oral history of my 2020. On my face is one of the masks I created through Teespring. Um, and while I am happy with the print quality, the pleating on the mask actually hides some of the text. And that's a little bit disappointing. However, uh, it is what it is. I will have a sweatshirt with the same thing, and the mask says, "Don't mind me. I'm suffering from pre-coffee apathy." Now it's 7 o'clock. I really don't drink coffee unless I'm out selling papers, so it's just me saying I don't give a rat's. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm going to take this mask off because, like most cloth masks, it makes my face sweat, and I really don't want to have to pull it off later. So, um, on a later stream this week, once I get the new sweatshirt, I will show it off. Um, but again, while the printing on the mask is awesome and looks good, uh, the pleating hides some of the text, which is unfortunate. But there it is. So I'll have to look at a redesign on that particular mask, and I will post it on my Teespring store, which I'll have the link for in the description, um, either later tonight or tomorrow. Um, so my 2020. My 2020 started off in Sacramento. I live in San Francisco, so at the time I was in a shelter, and I would spend some of the money I get from Social Security to go into a hotel. And I was in a hotel New Year's Day 2020. Now, uh, March or January and February weren't really remarkable, so I'll kind of skip over there. But I still had the habit of going to a hotel for a night or two at the beginning of the month so that I wouldn't have to be around a bunch of fucking homeless dudes. 325 of them to be exact, for a day or two, so I would keep my relative sanity, especially given my my situation. I'm not a very sociable person, as a lot of you know, and so there it was. Now I will say one thing about my trip in my trip to Sacramento on New Year's Eve. I remember my lock on my locker at the shelter I was at, which I will discuss in depth later. My locker, the lock on my locker was cut, and I had to get all my stuff back from staff a couple days afterwards because I had to deal with that and get a new lock and all that other lovely stuff. I was not really happy about it, but there it was. As I said, other than that, January and February weren't that memorable. And then news started trickling in about COVID at the end of at the end of February, and at the beginning of March, I got really sick. Now I did, um, um, I did what I had been doing, which was being in a hotel for a day or two, and literally I woke up and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't swallow anything at the beginning of March. And with the lack of information about COVID and some of the symptoms that I had, I thought I may have had COVID. So at the beginning of March, before everything shut down, I made the decision to stop selling papers because I had been sick and because I was concerned that I would get other people sick with the virus. I knew it was new. There were some things I found out about the virus uh, just by reading about it that a lot of people weren't paying attention to. And so, because of that, I stopped selling papers. And on the Ides of March, the 15th, 16th, everything went sideways. The world basically started shutting down. And that was kind of crazy. Now, the shelter I was in was doing absolutely nothing. And I mean, absolutely nothing to stem the potential spread of this virus. They didn't take it seriously. They didn't care about the residents at the shelter. And I had started a GoFundMe because of my disappearance from the scene. And I started journaling everything that I saw and they did at the shelter or what they didn't do at the shelter, um, in order for us to be healthier. Um, they didn't spread out the bunks. They kind of half-assed started spreading out the bunks by just telling people they couldn't come back if they lost their beds, which exacerbated the situation on the streets because um, people weren't getting access to the stuff they needed. They weren't moving people so that we would be physically distanced. And where I was, there was a cluster of about 40 beds in roughly 20 feet. The row I was in, there were multiple bunk beds, and they just weren't moving people. So anyone who may have been sick would have gotten sick. And fortunately, um, I didn't get it, as far as I know. Maybe I had already had it, but I had gone to a doctor and they said, well, you probably don't have it. So there it is. But anyway, so at the end of March, they moved a few of us over to the convention center. Now, the convention center was set up as a 400 bed, and I'll use that term loosely, 400 cot shelter that was supposed to be physically distanced, but there were no actual physical barriers. There was no real enforcement when we were there. There were 15 of us, 15 or so of us, and there was no enforcement of where people were sleeping. There was no enforcement. I mean, it was nuts. And on top of that, the food was supposed to be nice, but I mean, like, I don't eat fish, and we would get salmon every other freaking night. Now, I don't know about you. You might enjoy salmon, but I not only don't like the smell, I don't like the taste. And it was horrible. I mean, literally. Um, but it was only a weekend I was at the convention center. So I was at the convention center for a weekend. Then I got a text from a friend of mine who was still at MSC South saying the first two announced cases had been reported to the staff and the residents, and no one was allowed to go out except for smoke breaks. And it was an absolute mess. And I was fortunate enough to get out of the shelter before the mess hit. Now, one of the two people that was part of the first announced cases was someone I talked to regularly, and I haven't seen him since. And given his age, given his medical conditions, it wouldn't surprise me if he had died from COVID. And the person who told me about it was not this person. So a couple of the people I talked to, one of them decided he was going to go camp out south of San Jose. And there was that. So so when I found out, back to the story, when I found out that 2 people in the shelter had tested positive for COVID, I went to a supervisor at the convention center because, like I said, literally, it had just opened and there were only 15 of us. And I told them, hey, look, a couple people at MSC South just tested positive. What are you going to do about it? Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, and it took them a few hours, but they decided to send us all to a quarantine hotel. Now, the quarantine hotel I was in was called Site 6, I think, by the city, but it was a hotel called the Good Hotel at 7th and Mission, and it wasn't that good. I mean, it was like, it wasn't pay by the hour quality, but it was close. I mean, it was one of those so-called chic hotels where everything in the room was made out of recycled materials, and it was just ugly. But it was there. I started having real COVID symptoms. I still tested negative for it twice in 24 hours. But when I got to the hotel, not long after I got to the hotel, I started having a headache. A few days later, I started having a fever. I never lost my sense of taste or smell, but the food was so bad. And I don't mean it in a negative sense. I mean, it was healthy for a lot of people, but there were a lot of carbs. There were a lot of starches. It was just bad for me. And I was fortunate enough that I was getting some donations from the people I know, that I was able to keep myself fed when the food wasn't that good. And so, but I had COVID symptoms for 2 weeks. I remember in the middle of it, I have an issue with my bowels. I'm not trying to be gross, but sometimes when I go the number 2, I will get periods, and it's only once every few months, but it's still an issue. I would get periods where numbness would radiate from the bowel movement. And I think it was the Tuesday or Wednesday of the second week. It was Wednesday of the second week, early Thursday, where I passed out and fell off the toilet. And that was a little scary because that had never happened before. Now, I will grant that I was half awake. It was 4 a.m. But normally when something like that happens to me, whether I fall or whatever, I get right up. I didn't that time, which was a bit scary also. And so 18 hours later, I wind up going to the hospital. I get tested for COVID for the first time. And they tell me I have pneumonia, which was not good. And then I had also broken my nose from falling on my face. I mean, fortunately, I wasn't wearing my glasses, so my glasses didn't break, because I know healthcare is a mess now, especially because of COVID, and getting new glasses would have been impossible. Now, I can barely see without them, but I mean, I'm technically legally blind without my glasses. So there's that. Anyway, so I go to the hospital. They tell me I have pneumonia. They tell me I have a broken nose. They want me to follow up with an ear, nose, and throat doctor, which I never got to do because I was still in quarantine. Um, but the nose seems to have healed fine. Um, but they give me antibiotics for the pneumonia. My symptoms start to clear up, but being honest, if I had had COVID, I had already been exhibiting symptoms from when I got to the hotel. Um, so technically, of the lifespan of COVID was about the same time as uh, my getting over whatever it was I had. Um, and so, um, and there were points during uh, my quarantine where my temperature was 102, and that was a little ridiculous also. But again, here I am. A week after I go to the hospital, they call me cryptically, um, and say, "Hey, would you want to think about getting out of here?" And I'm like, "Well, I guess I don't have COVID, so yeah, sure." And so, oh, and one other thing, I was kind of isolated in the quarantine hotel room because they say, "Oh, call the office," and it turns out my phone was misprogrammed for the office, so I didn't even know the um, extension. I didn't know that my the office extension that was programmed into my phone was wrong, so I couldn't contact them if there was an issue. Um, and so a little later, after my visit to the hospital, I found out that was incorrect. Pardon me. And so um, the rest of my stay at the good hotel, or the bad hotel, whichever you'd like to call it, because when they're good, they're almost always bad. Anyway, uh, so the rest of my stay in the hotel was pretty much uneventful. I was, like I said, I was able to keep myself with food, um, through some of the donations I received, um, and the Friday before I came to the Whitcomb Hotel, which is where I am now and have been since the end of April. Um, that Friday they call me and give me this cryptic note. Well, we should think about getting you out of here, and we'll call you next week and we'll talk about it. The Sunday after that, they're like, "Oh, you need to get your stuff ready. We're going to move you." And I was like, "What?" I mean, it was that quick of a turnaround. Now, they said, "Oh, you have 15 minutes. Get ready. Get out. Get your stuff together, and we'll get you out of here." Um, and so I do that, and as is typical, it took them 3 hours to get us out of there, but they moved us here, and it was pretty straightforward. Having a little bit of freedom was nice. Um, the first thing I did, because I had this issue prior to going or during my hotel stay, was I didn't have enough stuff to have calories for myself, um, at the good hotel, which probably extended some of my um, some of the symptoms I had while I was there. Um, but the first thing I did was I went and bought food, um, and not long after that, I got my first stimulus check. I was about 3 weeks late or 3 weeks after normal people got their stimulus. And so, I bought some stuff for myself, which amazingly I still have. And pretty much the rest of the year is not much. I started doing YouTube videos, and I have a few. I won't post links to the videos because they're not very good. But you can find them on my channel, which you can see by pressing the link, my name, on the side of this video or on the bottom of this video, however you want to do it. I talked a lot about all the BS going on in Washington, especially Mr. Trump. And I decided to stop doing them for a while because I felt like all the videos I was doing were pretty much about the same thing. I would start ranting about some BS that people don't care about or don't understand. And while I won't go into them, I did say that, and this is kind of a reverse of what happened last week, but I did say that if you want to have your freedom, you really have to consider who's in charge. And while the people who attacked the Capitol last week and the people who are considering causing problems at state capitals are technically in power, because up until a few days ago, the Republicans basically controlled everything that happened out of Washington. We need to consider separation. And the reason I say that is simple. For people who believe in equality and fairness and non-discrimination and all that, if the people who control the laws and the judiciary and the power, you have to consider that if they're not going to allow you to do anything, and this goes for if you're Black, if you're Hispanic or Latino or Latinx or whatever you want to call yourselves, or a woman, or if you're gay or part of the LGBTQ community, if the people in charge are actively pursuing an agenda to deprive you of your rights, you have the right to demand equality, regardless of where you're at. And I'm going to go into an example of a couple of these things in a few minutes. But if you don't have a voice where while you have the right to demand equality, if the people in charge aren't going to give it to you, you have to take it for yourself. And I hate to say it that way. But the people that are supposedly disenfranchised now are afraid of losing power, and they're not afraid to take whatever they'd like without, and it is my belief that most Democrats will not oppose this. And it's because the Democratic agenda most recently has been about inclusion instead of exclusion. And while there's nothing wrong with that, when your freedom, your equality, and your ability to live your life is at stake, you cannot include these people who are trying to prevent you from having. And that's the simple truth. And I'll go into it. A couple of my friends, the friend I told you about who decided to go camping in San Jose, he kind of spoke in Trumpist conspiracy theories all through my time knowing him. And he sent me something about, he sent me something, an article trying to disprove Black Lives Matter um, ideology and all this other BS. Now, I believe that, as I've stated, I believe in equality. And I told him I'm not going to read it because the information is cherry picked. The information is, it was just, I could smell BS a mile away. And then he got mad at me because made excuses, blah, blah, blah. And so I took 5 seconds. I read the first 2 paragraphs. Then I sent him an email telling him not to talk to me again because it was spouting Trump theories. And while, there is always some truth in propaganda, there is no excuse for overt racism based on false information. And that's what it was. And I told him, look, if you're going to send me this stuff, I don't want to talk to you anymore. And I told him, look, I'm done speaking with you. Don't send me emails. Don't text me. Don't do anything. And I told him simply, and this kind of goes back to what I was talking about these insurrectionists, is we have to treat racists like we do known child molesters and rapists. Period. There's no excuse. And as long as we allow it or look past it, there's still no excuse. And as long as we tolerate it, it will always be there. And that's where we're at. And then I'll go into another example. Another of my friends, same kind of thing, different end of the spectrum. But it wasn't even that. He was talking about defunding the police and all this stuff. And while he had valid points, he was talking about these things. And let me make this clear: he's white. He was talking about canceling everybody for things that they've said previously that were probably acceptable or borderline at the time, and that's dumb. But while I believe you should be held accountable for the things you've said in the past, you can't erase history. You can't go back and change the things you said 10 years ago in order to appease these people. If they don't want to be part of the society that accepts that the past is the past, they can go live in their fantasy land, in my opinion. Now, but the thing that made me the angriest was he was talking about forcing change without changing it, without requiring change from the people themselves. Now, as I've said before, I understand Black Lives Matter, and I believe that the movement has merit and should continue to have merit. What I don't believe in is saying we should change everything and then make everything acceptable. and it's not work. It doesn't work. And I won't go into details of things I've seen, but it has to work both ways. What but even with all that, you talk about change, but then you don't accept the change that's needed, was my main angry point of it. He would talk about, well, we're going to get this and we're going to get this and we're going to get this. And I'm like, well, that doesn't do anything. And I went back 10 years. You talk about, George Floyd was a tipping point, but there have been riots before. Look at Trayvon Martin. Look at, what's his name? The kid from Wellston, Missouri. Look at, Eric Garner. Criminy. If we don't force wholesale change, it will never be changed. And my argument to people who argue for incremental change is, look at it this way. It's been 156 years since the slaves were freed. Why is there not equality now? And that's that. And so here it is. The rest of my year was pretty much uneventful. And I kind of off and on tried to go out and sell straight sheets just to pass time because I'm not really supposed to leave. And I do for a couple hours, but usually I try to keep it to a couple hours a few times a week. But so, the rest of the year is the rest of the year. We had an election. We're going to have a new president if idiots don't succeed in revolting against our government. And we're here in 2021. I'm glad it's here. I still don't know anything about any of our futures, especially mine, but here we are. And other than seeing a couple people I know outside of the hotel, it's really been a year of isolation. And luckily I'm built for that, but I still need human contact just like everyone else. So I hope this year finds you well. I will do another live stream on Thursday. It will be shorter than this. And hopefully I'll have my sweatshirt to show off. Other than that, thank you for watching and have a great night.